Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Michael always had a sensitivity that few people noticed. He seemed like the quiet type, the kind who kept everything to himself, but inside him there was an emotional radar tuned to the smallest signals. That morning, like so many others, he went to the corner cafe to clear his head. He liked that place for one simple reason: it was predictable. The same customers always sat at the same tables, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the waitress brought his drink without him having to ask. It was his moment of silence. He was on his second black coffee when something broke the routine. A woman approached his table, looked straight into his eyes, and sat down as if she'd been invited. Michael stared at her, confused. Light brown wavy hair, sunglasses pushed up on her head, tense but calculated expression. She didn't say her name, nor did she ask for his. She simply placed her phone on the table and said, bluntly, that his wife knew her boyfriend very well. It sounded out of context. He frowned, but before he could say anything, she slid the phone toward him and said, "Just look." For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he obeyed. He was in shock, but his fingers moved anyway. One swipe was all it took for everything to change. The images spoke for themselves: Claire, his wife, smiling next to a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, standing in a hotel hallway. Their hands touched with intimacy. The security camera's timestamp showed the date and time, last weekend. And the location was impossible to ignore: Grand Vista Hotel. Michael knew that place. He'd been there before, but for work. It was private, discreet. No couple goes there by accident. He felt his chest tighten, but his face remained calm. His veins pulsed, but he gave nothing away. He looked at the woman, who stayed motionless, as if waiting for the question he finally asked: why did she come to him? Her answer came quickly, rehearsed, as if she'd repeated it to herself many times. She said she'd been suspicious of her boyfriend for weeks: hidden messages, changes in routine, empty excuses. She hired a private investigator and found out he was cheating on her with Claire. When she received the reports, she thought about confronting him, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the desire to seek justice another way. She said she believed Michael deserved to know. Nothing more fair. She herself had suffered when she first saw the photos, and now she was passing that pain forward, not out of malice, but out of respect for the stranger sitting across from her. Michael absorbed everything in silence. He looked at the images again, trying to decipher the smiles. One of them made him shudder. It was the same smile Claire used when laughing at his jokes, or when they returned from a special trip. Now it was being used with another man, in a hotel hallway. It hit him like a punch. He leaned back in his chair, holding his breath. When he asked how she'd found him, the woman replied casually that the detective had gone above and beyond. He discovered the wife's identity, her social media, mutual friends, and eventually tracked down Michael. The world is small for those determined to find the truth. Rachel, that's how she introduced herself, only after everything else, took a deep breath, looked Michael in the eyes one last time, and said he had every right to keep those images. She asked for his phone number, quickly typed it into her own device, and sent him the photos one by one, along with the investigation details. As soon as he confirmed receipt, she locked her own phone and slipped it into her bag. There were no emotional goodbyes, no exaggerated gestures of empathy. Just a steady gaze, almost as if saying, "It's up to you now." Then she stood up and walked away, weaving between the tables as if she'd never been there at all. Michael remained seated, motionless. His phone buzzed with notifications of the received images, but he didn't need to open them again. He already knew by heart what he'd seen. For a while, he watched the cafe's activity as if he were outside his own body. The clinking of cups, the jingling of spoons, the overlapping conversations, everything felt distant. The peace he'd sought so much in Saturday mornings was now contaminated. What he'd seen wasn't just an affair. It was confirmation of something his heart had suspected but his mind had avoided naming. The kind of truth that doesn't shout, but destroys quietly. At that moment, instead of acting on impulse, Michael made a cold, calculated decision. He would invite Claire to lunch there, at the same table, at the same time. She wouldn't know anything. He needed to see her in her natural state, without defenses. He needed to understand how she behaved when she believed she was safe. It would be his own experiment. And above all, it would be the moment to confront silence with more silence. For the rest of the day, he carried on with his routine as if nothing had happened. He stopped by the grocery store, answered work calls, replied to his wife's messages as usual. She seemed calm. She asked if he wanted to eat out on Saturday. He said yes, and suggested the cafe. She agreed immediately. Said she loved that place. And it was true. He'd taken her there on their first wedding anniversary. That table had been the setting for so many conversations, plans, even laughter. Now it would be the stage for something that still had no shape, but already carried tension from the start. That night, while Claire slept peacefully beside him, Michael stayed awake for hours. His mind spun in circles, revisiting memories, analyzing details he'd previously ignored. She really had seemed distant over the past few weeks. Changed clothes more often, smiled at her phone, claimed she was too tired to talk. Everything had seemed so subtle that he'd convinced himself it was paranoia. But now he had images. He had a witness. And worse than that, he had certainty. It was no longer about speculation, it was about facing reality. The next day, he went to work as usual, passed colleagues in the hallway, talked about deadlines and goals as if he weren't carrying a hurricane inside. The only moment he nearly lost control was when his cousin Logan invited him to a family barbecue on Sunday. Michael almost refused immediately, but held back. Logan was too close to Claire. For some reason, that bothered him at that moment. It was a detail he tucked away, but one that would return with force later. As Saturday approached, Michael arranged everything for the meeting. He reserved the table, confirmed with the waitress that he wanted the usual spot. The girl found the repeated request odd, but smiled, unaware it would be the setting for something far bigger than a simple lunch. He even chose his shirt carefully, not to impress Claire, but to feel prepared. This wouldn't be an ordinary confrontation. There would be no raised voices, no jealous scenes. It would be the game of silence, where the liar reveals themselves without needing to be accused. When Saturday arrived, Michael left home earlier than usual. He was ready, phone in his pocket, expression composed, as if he'd already faced the hardest questions, internally. Before leaving, he passed Claire in the hallway and, with a steady voice, simply said, "I'll wait for you there." She smiled as if it were just another ordinary meeting between husband and wife, unaware that this lunch would mark a definitive shift in how he saw everything around him. Michael closed the door behind him without looking back. He carried with him the certainty that he was stepping into a game where he already knew the truth, but where pieces were still missing. What he didn't realize was that this was only the surface of something much bigger than a hidden affair. Claire arrived at the agreed time, wearing the same smile she usually used to soften any silence. She wore casual, understated clothes and carried over her shoulder the blue bag Michael had given her as a gift months earlier. She approached the table unhurriedly, as if it were just another ordinary Saturday, unaware that this meeting was anything but routine. Michael stood up and greeted her naturally. When she sat down, he noticed how carefully she adjusted her utensils, how she glanced around before starting any conversation, as if testing the ground. She asked about his work, mentioned a mutual friend who'd moved to Denver, talked about the rent increase at the gym she attended. Michael listened to everything, but paid attention to something else, the pauses she took between sentences, the way she fidgeted with her fingers while speaking, the effort to appear natural. Outwardly, she maintained the image of a calm woman, but inwardly, something wavered. He knew how to read that kind of discomfort. It was subtle, but it was there. After a few minutes, Michael mentioned he was thinking of making a reservation for the following weekend. Said it might be good for them to get away, change the scenery. She seemed excited, asked if he had a place in mind. Then he replied, Grand Vista Hotel. The words came out simply, almost as if choosing a restaurant. But Claire's reaction was immediate. She didn't look away or choke, but the slight tremble of her lower lip was enough. Michael pretended not to notice and kept flipping through the menu. The waiter approached, took their orders, and Claire, trying to compose herself, asked if he'd been there recently. Michael said it had been a while, but that he'd heard good recommendations. She nodded, keeping her gaze lowered longer than usual. It was clear she was trying to reorganize her thoughts. He didn't press, let time pass, as if the subject were just another ordinary couple's chat. He knew the confrontation wouldn't come from force, but from waiting. After the appetizer, between sips of water, he mentioned he'd run into an interesting person there. Claire feigned interest, asked who it was. Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his phone and, deliberately, scrolled to the images Rachel had sent him. He placed the device on the table, facing her, and slowly slid it toward her. Claire sat frozen for a few seconds. When she finally looked, she took a deep breath. It was her, in the photos. With another man. In the hallway. In the elevator. Smiling. For a few seconds, the silence between them was absolute. Then she tried to laugh. Said it wasn't what it looked like. That she could explain. That it had been a mistake. But none of the words she used sounded firm. Michael didn't question her. Didn't mock. He just looked at her with a terrifying calmness. That unsettled her more than if he'd raised his voice. She started crying and said she'd felt suffocated. That things between them had grown lukewarm. That for months, she'd tried to reignite something, but everything felt automatic. Said she needed to feel alive, desired. That the other man made her feel that way. That it wasn't love. It was impulse. A mistake, according to her, one she was willing to bury. Michael remained silent. He kept his eyes fixed on hers, as if searching for some trace of the woman who'd sworn loyalty to him years ago. She asked if he hated her. If there was someone else. If he wanted a divorce. But he didn't answer any of the questions. He only said that this meeting wasn't about making any decisions right then. That she needed to think whether what she'd done was part of a crisis, or whether it represented who she'd become. He said he'd think too, but that before anything else, he needed to understand if he could still trust someone who'd lied so convincingly. Claire tried to hold his hand, but he subtly pulled away. She then fell silent. Tears streamed down her face, and her breathing became irregular. Michael stood up calmly, said he'd pay the bill, and that she could leave whenever she wanted. There was no threat in his voice, no forced coldness. Just the exhaustion of someone who'd had the ground ripped out from under them but decided to stay standing. He left the cafe with the bitter taste of what was still to come. That conversation, as revealing as it had been, was only the beginning. He knew she'd now live through days of anxiety, trying to guess his next move. But at that moment, Michael had no concrete plans. Only the certainty that something between them had died. And if there was to be any rebuilding, it would be from the rubble of truth. Michael returned home that evening without hurry, without plans, without ready answers. Claire was already there. Her bag on the sofa, shoes left by the door, and a heavy silence filling the space. She appeared in the hallway and tried to smile, but he only stared at her briefly before heading to the bedroom. He changed clothes, washed his face, ignored the urge to ask questions. He was tired of theories. He just wanted to observe what would come next. Claire prepared dinner. The smell of food spread through the house, but it didn't stir his appetite. Still, he sat at the table. She served them both and asked if he was okay. He replied yes, without looking up. She tried to start a conversation about his work, about the new project he was beginning. He answered in short phrases. He noticed she was tense, yet trying to act naturally. As if a calculated effort were enough to erase what he already knew. Neither of them mentioned the lunch. It was as if they were testing each other in an invisible game. That night, Claire placed an extra pillow on the guest bed. Said she didn't want to pressure him, that she'd give him space. Michael acknowledged it with a nod. When she retired, he remained in the living room, TV on, thoughts spinning in circles. He felt a weight on his chest, as if something were compressing his very breath. Claire's face, when confronted with the images, kept returning to his mind. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the way she disguised it, how she tried to control the narrative, as if she still had some control over the situation. On Monday, breakfast in silence. Each left for their own commitments and returned at night under the same roof, but distant. Claire began leaving short notes, favorite recipes, messages recalling their early years of marriage. She tried to rebuild the bridge slowly, like someone who knows the structure is condemned but insists on reinforcing the beams. Michael read the notes, kept some, ignored others. He was in observation mode. At some point, he began revisiting memories. The trip they took to Seattle in their third year of marriage, the dinner where she cried talking about her late father, the day they painted the guest room together, laughing as paint splattered everywhere. Thinking about it caused a strange, almost physical pain. Because there was the woman he'd built a life with, and now that same woman hid secrets that made him feel like a stranger in his own home. During a brief hallway conversation, Claire said she'd blocked the other man. She spoke casually, as if that were enough to start over. Michael just listened. Later, she let slip that she felt ashamed, that she'd gotten lost in a neediness she didn't even know existed. That she wanted to become a better version of herself. He listened carefully, but his heart still refused to surrender to any possibility of reconciliation. Shortly after midnight, his phone vibrated. A new message. It was from her. Rachel. No small talk, no introductions. Just 4 words, I broke up with him today. And right after, and you, how was it? Michael stared at the screen for a while. His heart raced, but his mind didn't know how to respond. Because he himself still didn't know what breaking up meant. Breaking up a marriage? Breaking up love? Breaking up the past? Rachel's question struck him like a perfectly aimed arrow, making it clear that while he hesitated, others were already closing chapters. And deep down, that's what it was about now, closing, or pretending that starting over is enough. The next morning, Rachel's message was still there, waiting for a reply. I broke up with him today. And you, how was it? Michael read it again, but remained silent. It wasn't the time to respond. He felt that any hastily written word might seem like escape, confession, or invitation. And at that moment, he didn't want any of that. He was only certain of one thing: he couldn't keep living with someone who'd shattered trust like breaking a glass and expecting the shards to be quietly swept away. Claire woke up earlier than usual, made coffee, and placed an extra cup on the table. She hoped he'd join her, that he'd give some sign of openness. When he appeared in the kitchen, he got straight to the point. Said he'd thought a lot, turned everything over in his head, listened to what she had to say. But what he felt now was something else. A mix of relief and finality. He was ready. And he said this looking directly at her, he was ready to separate. Claire froze. Asked if there was a chance to start over, if he needed more time. He replied it wasn't about time anymore. It was about truth. And theirs had been left behind. The next day, Michael packed his things and left home. He preferred renting a small apartment near work, where he could reorganize his life without memories hanging on the walls. The division was done fairly, as they'd agreed. Claire kept the house, some furniture, and part of their assets, while Michael left with the investments held at the bank. They put it all on paper without fights, but inwardly he knew what really mattered had been lost long before. To him, objects no longer held symbolic value. He didn't care about taking paintings, utensils, or physical mementos of a marriage that had rotted from within. He just wanted distance from the routine that disguised the wear. He needed air, silence, a new place where he could hear himself without the echo of lies. Claire tried to maintain minimally cordial contact. She talked about bills, documents, practical matters. Sometimes she used these topics as an excuse to start conversations, ask how he was, mention something from her routine with a hint of nostalgia. Michael replied only what was essential, leaving no room for sentimental dialogue. He was determined not to backtrack. He slept poorly, thought a lot, but used time to his advantage. He started running in the mornings, leaving the office more often, taking care of his diet. Loneliness was uncomfortable, but also revealing. He was rediscovering his own company in a way he hadn't experienced in years. On some nights, he remembered the good moments with Claire. The day she waited for him with a surprise dinner, the time they planned a trip with no itinerary, lazy Sundays on the couch. But the sweet memories always collided with more recent ones. The hotel images, her smiles with another man, the cold excuses, the eyes avoiding his while she lied. That's what kept him firm in his decision. The separation hurt, but it hurt with purpose. It was a clean wound. It hurt because it cut away what was already rotting. And the more time passed, the more he felt he was truly breathing for the first time in a long while. A few weeks later, on an ordinary afternoon, while answering emails on his phone, a new message arrived. It was from Rachel. "Sorry to push, but what happened with you two?" He took a while before replying. He took a deep breath and wrote only, "We separated." Her reply was immediate, "Want to grab coffee with me?" At the same place as before. He stared at that sentence for several minutes before deciding. It sounded familiar, yet carried a light curiosity. There were no promises or expectations, just an invitation. The next morning, Michael went to the cafe. He sat at the same table where Rachel had first appeared. When she arrived, she had a different haircut, lighter clothes, but the same gaze, direct, no frills. They talked for over an hour. First about neutral things, work, routine, how the whole process had been. Then, about wounds, fears, and that strange feeling of having lived a parallel story to the others. Rachel said she felt lighter. Said that despite the pain, knowing the truth had been liberating. Michael admitted he was still adjusting to the silence, but already felt life was making space again. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they'd known each other longer than they actually had. They laughed at trivial things, exchanged thoughts about relationships, shared scars. There was a strange calm there. A harmony that surprised them both. And when they said goodbye, it wasn't as accomplices of a painful revelation, but as two people who might perhaps begin something new, without hidden ghosts between the chairs. Time passed, and their meetings became frequent. Nothing was rushed. They got to know each other slowly, without hurry. Michael began allowing himself again. Trusting small gestures, honest conversations, subtle affection. Rachel was different from Claire. More direct, less concerned with appearing perfect. And maybe that was exactly what attracted him to her. The way she faced the truth head-on, even when it hurt. In little time, they officially started dating. It was light, simple. For the first time in a long while, he felt whole beside someone. Claire found out about the relationship through a mutual friend. At first, she just commented dismissively. Then she called him. She wanted answers. Said it was absurd for him to be with that woman. Wanted to understand how he could move on so quickly. Michael listened patiently, let her speak, but when her tone crossed the line, he interrupted. Said they'd already moved past that phase. That their marriage had ended, with all the pain that involved. And that now, each was taking care of their own life. He didn't say it out of anger. He said it as closure. And that definitively ended whatever was left between them. After hanging up, he returned to the living room and found Rachel waiting with 2 coffees and a gentle smile. He sat beside her and thought that, despite everything he'd lost, he'd found something new. Something built from truth, even if it had arrived in the most painful way possible. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.